Right, okay, so there are 5 cowboys. You know,
No. Where's the goddamn horizon?
It's there.
Where?
At the top of the painting.
All right, get over here. Now remember this. When the horizon's at the bottom, it's interesting. When the horizon's at the top, it's interesting. When the horizon's in the middle, it's boring as shit.
That's it. That's cinema in a nutshell, right?
The cinema. What an interesting way to end a movie.
I know.
So bizarre to me. I mean, so we're obviously talking about the Fabelmans, Steven Spielberg's sort of life story-ish, at least the first part of his life. Interesting movie, and we're going to dive into it, of course. But yeah, what an odd way to end it. It just didn't really...
And to cast David Lynch in the role of John Ford.
Yeah, just the whole thing just felt a little bit so disconnected from the rest of the film almost. Almost like it was like a big wink.
I have a theory, but we'll get to that.
We'll dive into it. This is Film Trace, folks. This is a podcast where we trace the life of a film from conception to production all the way to release and reception. We are currently in the set in the 1950s cycle, our 6th cycle, and we are talking about the most recent films post 2010, Asteroid City by the one and only Wes Anderson, and The Fabelmans, which came out last year by Steven Spielberg. How do you want to dive into this? This is we have a big history with Wes Anderson, both of us.
Yes.
So I feel like we gotta confess. This is like the confession part of the podcast,
right?
Because we already sort of did that once when we did French Dispatch. Was that was a while ago,
right? With Harry 5. From Try Love, and we were also looking at the Royal Tenenbaums since it was the anniversary of that film.
Yeah.
I kind of want to start off by making it clear that I had a moment of self-realization last night at a concert. I overheard 2 guys talking to each other in between bands, and they were just ranking Wes's filmography.
Love it.
And I mean, I could definitely
have done 1,000 times.
Give into that impulse and do that here. But I had a kind of like a out of body looking in kind of experience. And I was like, I'm going to make sure not to do that on the pod because that sounds boring and trite. And
it's what every film podcast has ever done. But anyways, here's my ranking. Because it's more important to tell the personal journey, I think, with Wes Anderson more than anything. And I think you should start.
Okay. And not to repeat too much of what we already did on that French Dispatch episode. I definitely recommend it. Harry's a great guest. Has a lot of good insight, especially into like the French inspirations. Like Wes is an expat in France, and obviously that made sense for his last film. But for this one, he's back in America, Middle America, even a cartoonish version of the 1950s desert landscape. And the thing that kind of stood out for me the most that connects back to my own personal journey with Wes Anderson's movies is that for me, it was the first time in a long time. And I know you disagree, Dan, but we'll get into that. But for me, it felt like the thing that like kind of drew me to his movies in the first place. And, I had done the classic, like I saw Rushmore and then I immediately wanted to see Bottle Rocket and grabbed it off the shelf at Blockbuster. And with Bottle Rocket, even more so than Rushmore, just for me personally, that feeling of like wanting to just like hang out with the characters was super strong. Just like this kind of warm, like smile inducing, just like these are people that are strange and, the music's quirky and the symmetry is, either cringe inducing or breathtaking, depending on your point of view, or maybe a little bit of both. And with Asteroid City anyways, I have to be completely honest and upfront. Like that's where I felt myself kind of landing with like every single scene. Was just like, these are weird dudes and dudettes that I just want to like spend time with. But yeah, so I mean, it's been a lifelong obsession. I named my firstborn kid after the character of Dignan from Bottle Rocket, and I also have to like confess to like the bias that I not only saw the movie with my wife, the mother of my kid Dignan, and also we saw it in the movie theater where we got married, like this old historic place in Minnesota.
That's amazing.
So it was a very special experience. But now it's your turn, Dan. Take us on the other side of that journey.
The other side here's the thing about Wes Anderson. I think for both of us, and the most important thing to, even if you're listening to this, to understand is that like it's a relationship that goes back 20 years. Mm-hmm. From when we were like in high school or in college, the formative years, coming of age, both of us found Wes Anderson and his films, and really I've seen basically every single one except Isle of Dogs. I've seen it like opening weekend or something, or somewhere close. Like it's just one of those things where I've always respected deeply what he is doing. I've loved most of his films. And it's just I say that because there's a closeness to my viewpoint of this film, and sort of an intimacy that may come across as maybe crass or mean or overly critical. But I think it's one of those things where it's like when you're close to something, and I'm not close to Wes Anderson, I'm close to my interpretation or my experience of his films. It's a really important thing to me. Mm-hmm. And so I'm going to come into Asteroid City with a lot more, one, baggage, and two, discernment about what's going on screen. I'm going to be hyper engaged with everything. And if it doesn't taste right, if it tastes kind of bitter, it's going to be kind of extra bitter, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I think that's the one thing, I saw this maybe a couple of weeks ago, and it was like a weekday night. I went solo, and there was three other people in the theater. So it was a nice kind of like, in my mind, a perfect viewing experience. Like after work, nearly empty theater. It's just me pretty much in the screen. And I think, Asteroid City to me has all of these amazing elements, and I kept on being wowed by them. I mean, just as someone who is a fan, I've literally been going through the Billboard country charts from the 1950s, and so like hearing some of those songs that are like very, very deep cuts in like 50s country music, like in the background, just hovering, wonderful. I mean, there's the actors are phenomenal. The look and the production design is next to none. I mean, he is truly one of the most, I think, gifted directors that has been around in our lifetime, without a doubt. I think the thing that like struck me immediately, and again, it's like it's hard to view any one of his films in isolations because of our experiences and relationship with his old films. It's like French Dispatch, I didn't love. I think Asteroid City to me is way worse than that.
What?
Way worse. And it's sort of like, it's making me think and go back and be like, oh, where did I go off on a different path? Because I think it's as much about Wes and what he's doing, and also about us and like where we are in our lives and which paths we're taking and where we're going. And I gotta be honest, like the last Wes movie that I absolutely adored was Grand Budapest, and it's my favorite Wes film. And it's just, I think, how do you want to dive into this? Because I could just rant and rave for like hours about this, but I think I want to be somewhat constructive and think about like how this thing got made.
Right. And I kind of want to question, because there are, he did some press for the movie, but it's definitely not as oblique as French Dispatch was. Clearly a love letter to the New Yorker. And it's not as kind of universal as, I don't know, Rushmore or even Royal Tenenbaums kind of were, which is, where his career really popped off. How do you get from like an expat living in France, writing a movie that takes place in France, to all of a sudden going back to 1950s desert America, and like combining elements of science fiction, like meta theater, frame story? What's the germ of this idea? I think we only can really do speculation unless you found anything in the research.
He said something. That's the only like interview quote that I pulled. He goes, Wes goes, it has to do with a kind of Euro take on the American West. I thought a lot about Wim Wenders, and I've always loved his interpretation of the landscape and the people in it. American stuff fascinates him from a sort of Berlin point of view. And it comes back in a way that makes it fresh for me. He took a lot of still photographs out in California, Nevada, Arizona, places like that. In our early days, Owen and I loved Sam Shepard, which is immediately pops into my head when I'm thinking about this.
Yeah,
he's from California, but his take on the West is filtered through an avant-garde perspective. He goes to New York before he starts to tell these stories. His New York is Patti Smith, Lou Reed. It's a downtown rocker New York. I think it's also a kind of Euro thing. And then he ends up in collaboration with Wim Wenders on Paris, Texas. A hint, not really an origin of the story, but I think at least the perspective that he's bringing is that sort of it's the American West in capital letters, right? It is this concept that people have of what lays west of the Mississippi River in the United States. It's a very mythological place in American culture and literature and film. What is it actually like? I don't know. People, you've been there. I've been there. It's sort of like what people think that it is, but it also has nothing to do with these stories that are being made, right? It is, the American West is perfect for Wes because it's a snow globe idea and world that he can kind of pick and choose his little paper cutout dolls and put them on the screen where he wants to and have them act the way he wants to. So I think, to me, it's just like, it's an East Coast Western. Is really what it comes down to. Yeah.
And I think I'm actually looking back at other older interviews with him because he co-wrote the film did co-story credit with Roman Coppola, right? Yeah. And that's who co-wrote Darjeeling and Fantastic Mr. Fox. Yeah. So I'm looking back at an old interview that both of them did, along with Baumbach, who co-wrote Fantastic Mr. Fox for that press tour. Okay. And they talk a lot in there about, because the question from the interviewer on IndieWire is about, trying to elevate Roald Dahl's story so that Fantastic Mr. Fox kind of comes through both for, a family audience as well as the regular Wes Anderson acolyte, right? And they speak to, again, like you're talking about, like filtered 1950s, and it kind of gives me insight into the theater aspect of the film, because they talk a lot about Marlon Brando, and he was famously a stage actor that kind of came onto the world of film, and with the help of everybody from Montgomery Clift to Elia Kazan, like kind of revolutionized cinema from like an actor's point of view anyways. And one of the key takeaways that my wife and I were talking about after seeing Asteroid City is how much it was Wes kind of playing to his strengths as an ensemble director, where it's like every single, whether even taking the theater frame story out of it, for those that haven't watched Asteroid City, it's probably not going to make a lot of sense, but for those that have,
if you do see it, it's not going to make much sense either. So,
but I mean, you bring up the avant-garde point, the Wim Wenders connection. I mean,
it's all there,
right? But like you said, it's so heavily filtered that unless you have those reference points, it can come across as kind of disjointed.
Well, I was trying to now it's like popping into my head, like thinking back to, we were having a great discussion with Riley we have a Slack, and he's been on the show before, 28 Days Later. And he, one of the criticisms I think that the average film goer is going to have when they see this, and the average film goer does not like this movie. Like I look at the Google ratings, it's like 2 out of 5. It's bad, which sort of makes sense. He brought up the fact that like there's always this sort of, I guess it's breaking the fourth wall. I don't know if that's the right term. There's a clear postmodern canvas here that Wes is always using, whether it be sort of, what was it, a play in Rushmore, a book in Royal Tenenbaums, a nature documentary in Steve Zissou, or what was it, a memoir in Grand Budapest. He's always pointing to the fact that a story is being created by somebody.
Yeah.
And he never shies away from that. And I think here he is basically like the supersized version of that, if that's the right term.
Yeah.
Where it's just like, it's so intense and incessant, these breaks. And there's like severe breaks, like Bryan Cranston will be in this TV studio, and then there's a moment like an hour and a half, maybe hour and a half in or something, where he's on the set in Asteroid City. It's like, and the weaving in and out of the play scenery with the film itself, and it's very easy, I think, for the viewer to get lost. I wasn't necessarily lost. I was just bored by it. But it's just like, I'm literally reading somebody's Google review just because, like, I want to see what the people say. It reads to me as like the classic style over substance situation, and I do wonder, because you and Riley had different reactions to it. How do you sort of respond to the convoluted nature of sort of the story within a story within a story thing?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely something that's going to either click or not. Riley made a good reference point, Charlie Kaufman's Synecdoche, New York, which was a movie that I very much, for the first half of it, was just like, okay, this man has gone too far. And then with the second half of the film, and I think so much of it has to do with Philip Seymour Hoffman's performance. Similarly, I think so much of what makes Asteroid City click for me, probably not necessarily halfway through, like Synecdoche, but definitely like in points, like I do have to kind of like give it a lot of good faith as I'm watching it. And I can see why, for an average viewer or even a Wes Anderson diehard, you could maybe it does test your patience, but I do think that like the kind of Russian doll aspect of the story, I find it fascinating because there are specifically so many different layers to the allegorical nature of the story. You could look at it as a parable about COVID. It's also easily looked at as yet another kind of entry in Wes Anderson's oeuvre about grief, and specifically like father kid-child relationships. I kind of had like an epiphany one moment when I was talking with, once again, my wife about Wes Anderson movies a long time ago. It was back in like the 2000s. So it was probably right around the time where so many of us were disappointed by Darjeeling Limited. And I think one of the things that was really difficult for me about that film is that it was so like outwardly about grief that it ended up feeling hollow. I'd be interested to revisit it today and see if that feeling holds, or if I was just kind of a snobby mid-20s kid that wanted another Royal Tenenbaums. But I do feel like with Asteroid City, between the performances and the multi-layered aspect and the kind of more gentle touches that fill every scene of dialogue, having to do with grief, and especially like the connection between that idea of creation and grief, of like making something after you've lost something, of finding something after you've lost something. And that's where, spoiler alert, the alien shows up, which I can imagine is also like a pretty controversial flashpoint for some people, because it evokes similarly the kind of let down feeling that comes with like the third act of Life Aquatic and finding the jaguar shark. And it maybe is, a little bit of him recycling himself, but he's also a director that's all about familiarity. And I don't think that I buy the style over substance arguments, if only because like there's so much to like pick apart and unearth, and because it clicked for me, I was happy to sit there with a shit-eating grin on my face and pick it apart as I watched, and then afterwards, think about it over and over again and revel in it.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, like reading through the average reviews that I'm seeing from, just normal random people on Google or whatever. There does seem to be, and also going through all the critical views, there does seem to be different layers here of responses. There's definitely the positive, effuse, like sort of, hey, I mean, like the one that like sticks out to me is, let's see if I can find it really quick, by Richard Brody at the New Yorker, which I think you talked about on Slack.
Yeah.
The quote that sticks out to me: "The notion of a perfect film is absurd, but some movies attain an ideal synthesis of the director's body of work. Wes Anderson's latest Asteroid City is one such film." And I think that like that's a really good diving in point to sort of having a critical discussion of the movie, because he's right? Like when you watch this movie and you've seen all of Wes Anderson's films, it's going to feel familiar. It's going to feel comfortable. It's going to scratch that itch that his movies always tend to scratch. Now, it's way more than you would have got during Bottle Rocket or Rushmore or even Steve, but I think it's not that far from Grand Budapest. It seems kind of in the same snow globey world. And then, French Dispatch, I think, is kind of a continuation of that style. So there's no doubting here that Wes is continuing the path that he has laid down, or sort of hacked over the years through the, forest of cinema. Can I say that? I'm saying it. Right. He's continuing the same path. There's not necessarily, or less like, is there anything in Asteroid City that you feel like is Wes sort of stretching himself in a way that he hadn't done before?
I would say that if it works for you, that Russian doll approach of the play, and like you were referencing or comparing it to, the kind of cookie cutter, it works and it's lovely and he does it in a very cute manner, but like it's ostensibly, like you said, he kind of did the same thing, just with different genres from, Rushmore all the way through Grand Budapest. And, I think there's definitely an argument to be made for how each of one of those is just like more defined and more obvious. And this one is kind of like a what the frick moment. But I kind of admire the fact that he kind of like took everything and threw it at the wall. I think it's a different side of the coin, where the other side is French Dispatch, where it felt like he, once again, like threw a lot of things at the wall, but that never really congealed for me. I think that at least Asteroid City has like tons of heart in it, and also has a lot of like, obtuse, yes, but really meaningful connections if you're willing to dig for them. And if you're not willing to dig for them, that's fine. I think that's kind of where he's challenging himself. And I also do think that like it's very possible, like he, even if you just want to watch his movies for the visuals and the music, like there's still like plenty to be enjoyed upon. He collaborates with Jarvis Cocker of Pulp again, like he did for Fantastic Mr. Fox, and Sue George from Life Aquatic is the guitarist cowboy. So like, yes, he is kind of doing what you'd expect, but it's like you kind of said, a supersized version of that. And I also will say that like the thing that stood out to me once again to make the Fantastic Mr. Fox connection is that like this movie felt like a really interesting and comforting synthesis between his animation work and his live action work. Like he finally found this kind of like midpoint that like it's to have like a literal Roadrunner, and then also have like Tom Hanks, musing about what we do for the people we love, like that. It's amazing that you can put both of those in there, and it at least works for some people.
Yeah, I mean, I think that like the one thing where he's clearly extending himself is in this sort of self-referential area where he's putting a mirror up against himself way more than he ever has before in this movie. And I think like the play stuff and how he sort of turns that up to 11, the sort of meta narrative, is something different, right? The other sort of attempts at this are quaint. Like I go back to Rushmore, where it's like the scenes are with the theater drapes and stuff, the different like seasons or months, whatever it was, and Royal Tenenbaums too, like the book chapters and stuff.
Yeah.
Those are nice little flourishes, right? But here, it's literally changing the location, changing the characters in a very, very abrupt way. So it's like, I think if nothing, that's a huge change for him in the sense that like he's really trying to wrestle with a new type of narrative or filmmaking that he hasn't really done before. So at the very least, it's a super interesting film to watch. And so I think, thinking about like Richard Brody said, is like, this is like the amalgamation of all his body of work into a, quote unquote, perfect film. What's interesting, though, too, is that there's these layers of critical reaction. Here's the reality. If you have never seen a Wes Anderson movie before and you see this, you're probably not going to like it. You're probably going to hate it. That's a lot of people. Like, that's tens of millions of people that have never seen one of his movies before. If you've even seen like half of them, you're still going to be like, ugh, what? So like you kind of have to throw out, honestly, most average sort of viewers here. But what I find interesting within the subset of people that know Wes Anderson and like his films, there's like these two different divergent viewpoints. There's one where, I'll quote Variety, Asteroid City looks smashing, but as a movie, it's for Anderson diehards only, and maybe not even too many of them, which I think is interesting because I've heard it played both ways. If you're a Wes Anderson fan, you're going to love this film. If you're a Wes Anderson fan, you're going to hate this film. I've heard that back and forth, literally for the last few weeks. And I want to know, like, what do we make of that? Is it just such a confounding film that he's doing something, significantly more extreme that he's done before, kind of jumping off the cliff into this sort of Wes Anderson aesthetic, which became huge on TikTok? I don't follow social media, so was it TikTok that became huge?
Yeah, it was TikTok. Yeah.
Like thinking about that now and how, people under 30 are viewing his work and seeing his work. I think at the same time, Wes does not engage with this at all. It doesn't seem like. He seems to be in his own little world. He reminds me of like a caricature of like an old school philosopher who, spends his days in his office or maybe on the set, has a very specific schedule, drinks the same type of coffee every morning, does the same exact thing the same time every day, but in his it's kind of more like a Candyland version of all of these things. And I think the whole like discourse here is tough because the only statement that he's making is the film itself, and he's doing some interviews and stuff like that, but he's not a really public persona guy. And I do wonder if he's become a little bit too self-isolated in terms of, making films or trying to engage with an audience. The one critical viewpoint that sticks out in my head is the Washington Post said, maybe the whole endeavor is some kind of self-portrait of an artist. It is. I think we'd both admit that, right?
Yeah.
Maybe the whole endeavor is some kind of self-portrait of an artist who doesn't know what he wants to say anymore. Which is the thing that when I was watching this, I was on the one hand excited, thrilled because it was so beautiful and the acting was so phenomenal and interesting and what they're saying was interesting. But when I go back and we'll talk about Fabelmans here in a bit, I think about Steven Spielberg, and what Spielberg does so well is he can have a scene about anything. Even when we were watching, what would we do our last season, the Terminal Stranger Than Fiction series.
Yeah.
Every single scene had a purpose. Every single scene had a narrative sort of inertia to it. It doesn't matter how small it was or how big it was. And to me, when watching Asteroid City, it felt inert. Like it just didn't, it's not moving. And from an emotional perspective, but you didn't feel that way at all, right?
No. And I think, you use this term a lot when talking about his movies, the snow globe world, right?
Yeah.
And I kind of alluded to the concept of like a hangout movie at the top of the show. And I think that's ultimately what it comes down to. Like, I know the one hangout movie that comes to mind that I know you're a fan of, Drinking Buddies, for instance.
Yes.
Joe Swanberg.
Although I don't know that I'd call it a hangout movie. I don't know. We'll keep going.
But I mean, the notion is there.
Sure. Yeah.
Wes Anderson, because he gives into so many of his impulses, yes, he becomes arguably less concerned, like he perhaps once was earlier in his career, with the idea of a like narrative propulsion machine, right?
Yes.
And somebody like Spielberg is constantly examining that and trying to be true to that, no matter what genre he's playing with. And I think especially because he's always playing to a broad audience. He's a populist filmmaker, whereas Wes has kind of, started resting on his laurels, so to speak. But I just think that there's purpose to both. I think it makes sense that Grand Budapest is your favorite because that was totally him working on all cylinders, trying to make essentially a tight caper film that also had like a lot of the, bells and whistles that come with a Wes Anderson movie. The thing that I don't know, really resonates with me about Asteroid City, for instance, and not to compare it because I think like those two movies are doing something very different, is Grand Budapest. It felt like the caper story was up top, and like the story about the relationship between Ralph Fiennes and the bellhop was secondary. And here it feels flipped. Like everything that's going on with Jason Schwartzman and Tom Hanks, everything that's going on with Ed Norton and Adrian Brody, like that felt like, going back to your Sam Shepard mention, is like, it's all about character. It's all about like trying to get at the emotional truths within single scenes. And he, is caring less about how it, goes from piece to piece. And I think that is largely answered by the fact that, even in the actual narrative of the film, the alien is seen, and then we're supposed to, all the characters are supposed to pretend like they didn't see anything. And then all hell is, breaks out when they are told they, can't leave quarantine, even though they were told that quarantine was going to end soon. And that's kind of how grief works, right? It's, I think, a little more emotionally truthful than trying to fit it into this kind of tight narrative that's going to, follow you along from scene to scene, because you feel more like the blindsidedness, the meanderingness, the kind of emptiness that one feels when one experiences grief. And that just rings more true for me than, if it was a movie about grief, but then also about, hunting this alien or something, I think that if you don't have that patience and personal connection, it could easily fall apart. But I also think that's one of the beautiful things about his filmography, is that, you could easily, argue with a friend about how to rank it in between sets at a concert, and it's going to be different for everybody. And yet we're all going to go see, like you said, his movies on opening weekend. And I mean, I hope that the next one he comes out with, it hits you, even if it doesn't hit me.
What is the next one coming out? It's The Wonderful Story of Henry Sugar.
Yeah, I don't know if we're going to call that a feature. Is
it just like a episode or something?
37-minute adaptation of a Roald Dahl story for Netflix.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
And people are like, why didn't you make it in a feature? And he's like, Netflix told me I didn't have to. It felt like a 37-minute story. So he's fucking around. So
I love that you chose The Fabelmans as the counter, because we had a different movie. What was the other one we were supposed to watch?
James Franco's Howl.
Yeah, thank God. Which I started and I was like, oh my God.
Yeah, no, I couldn't do it. I wanted to talk about Ginsberg, but let's just talk about Spielberg.
It's a perfect juxtaposition because it's like...
That's what I thought, yeah.
Yeah, The Fabelmans is all about Steven Spielberg talking about filmmaking, which is essentially what Asteroid City, I think, is at least, winking at very strongly. I think it's worth saying that I am probably a massive Spielberg apologist, pretty much across the board. Like I loved him. I mean, my favorite film growing up was Jaws. It was maybe like the first film that I truly loved. And, so he's had his ups and downs, trying to look back at his sort of career. And, I've always sort of loved Saving Private Ryan is one of my favorite movies of all time. I recently watched AI, hated it, so that's a whole different story.
That's my second favorite Spielberg.
Oh my God. What's your first?
The Fabelmans.
Is it really?
I think it is, actually, yeah.
Oh my God, this is going to get really interesting. Who doesn't have a relationship with Steven Spielberg? Every living person on this globe does, which makes him kind of a special director. He's just probably the most recognizable director in the world. He's getting to the end of his career. He's like, is he in his 80s, I think, or his 70s?
Yeah.
And so, his career's starting to wind down a bit. And I think The Fabelmans is something that he's wanted to make for a very long time. The idea popped up when he was working with screenwriter Tony Kushner, who is one of my heroes, and I love. Tony Kushner is an amazing writer. I met him once. He's phenomenal. Read Angels in America, if you haven't read it.
Former theater guy once again.
Yeah, theater guy. Yeah, exactly. And so the idea came up when Steven and Tony were working on the script for Munich back in 2004. Spielberg told him about his sort of life story, and Kushner's like, you have to write about this. Like, you just have to. And it took, basically 15, 16 years before they got to do it. And then they basically wrote the script together in like the last few months of 2020 during the pandemic. And so we essentially get Spielberg's life story up until, how old is he at the end of this movie? Early 20s or something? Or is he younger than that? Okay.
Maybe even younger,
yeah. And I found it to be, I was reluctant to even see it because I don't like movies about people's own lives, if that makes sense. There's directors. I don't really love movies about Hollywood. I think they're mostly boring. Except it's Babylon. It's genius.
I was going to say.
So much fun. That movie's ridiculous and terrible, but it's so much fun. But yeah, you seem to really like this movie, and you're not a huge Spielberg guy. I'm
not.
Yeah.
And I'm actually having kind of a realization as I'm looking at his filmography, which I've stared at who knows how many times in my life as a film geek. But, of course, I love Jaws. I love Raiders of the Lost Ark. I love E.T., whatever. But, I'm actually noticing that my favorite movies of his are all the ones that he not only directed, but either wrote or co-wrote.
Interesting. Okay.
So AI, he, rewrote based off of a Kubrick kind of unfinished business. Huge fan of that film.
Yeah.
I also adore Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Yeah. And the only other film in his filmography that he contributed to the script, if you don't count Firelight, his amateur initial film, is Poltergeist, which, technically his name isn't credited, but, you could do a whole film trace cycle of episodes probably about Toby Hooper versus Steve Spielberg.
Oh, man, who knows? I don't even know what to make of that.
But I love that film too. I think that it's interesting how, for a guy that's so prolific, how little he's actually contributed to the scripts of the movies that he's directing. Because
that is interesting.
Yeah.
Because compared to Wes Anderson, like Wes,
right.
Has Wes ever shot a script that wasn't at least partially? Okay. Yeah.
And compared to like all of like the major American auteurs, whatever,
yes,
right?
Scorsese, right?
Yeah.
I think, right? I don't know off the top of my head, but well, I mean, you said it earlier where Spielberg is, I think, playing a different game maybe than a traditional auteur, right? Like,
true.
He helped create what we know as blockbusters. Right, with Jaws, Close Encounters, right, as a Lost Ark, E.T.,
Jurassic Park.
He sort of kind of dyed the cast of what a big summer movie is, and I think that's obviously has become intertwined with his own sense of self. That like he feels like he does need to swing for the fences and wow people. And not just people who live in Silver Lake or people who live in Cobble Hill in Brooklyn, right? Like he wants people in Omaha and San Antonio to watch his movies and be like, oh, this is really fascinating. This is really interesting, which is cool because The Fabelmans isn't one of those movies.
Yeah, exactly.
It's just not. It's not Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. Like it's
not even like The Color Purple or Always or anything. Yeah.
Yeah. Or Munich, even. Like it's obviously an incredibly personal film across the board. I mean, he says it's not. The way that he describes these scenes, where it's like there's impeccable detail that he has, and then like he'd start crying on set, but then he's like, "Oh, it's also not autobiographical completely." And you're like, I don't really know. There's a messiness here to this movie that's kind of really fascinating. Because it's like you have one of the best directors who's probably ever lived, and then he's trying to make one of the most personal film he's ever made, and he's kind of weaving in and out of what's true, what's not true. Is this his interpretation? Is this how he thinks other people in his past interpreted what's happening? It's a messy film, but I think a messy concept. But the film itself is actually very tight. Would you agree with that?
Oh yeah, totally. It's, and I'm a fan of Tony Kushner, but I'm not crazy about the script that he did for Lincoln, which was a movie.
So good.
Which was a movie that I was really looking forward to, but I felt, lacked a lot of what made so many of Spielberg's history-based films go down so easily. I think that what happens here is because you have that personal connection and everything's scaled down, that it becomes essentially a domestic drama, coming of age story.
Yes.
That like it's kind of incredible to see how that filters through both the cinematic lens of Spielberg as well as the kind of theatrical lens of Kushner, because it feels like they're both like 100% in their wheelhouses.
Yes.
Spielberg's bringing this kind of like majestic quality to it, and Kushner's bringing this kind of like intense introspective quality to it.
And there's a grittiness to his writing. It always
has. Yeah. The whole scene with Judd Hirsch as the grandpa, Short Visit is like incredibly just like visceral, and like you said, it feels like there's frayed edges all over the place.
Yes,
going back to the opening clip from the show, the ending itself feels kind of like a curious kind of like throwaway story. But that's one of the things that makes this so much more interesting, I think, than a lot of like autobiographical films. We are going to talk about a movie called This Boy's Life later in the season from '93 that kind of fits everything into the nice little like standard package of the coming of age story, autobiographical kind of look back at Americana and small town life. And here it just feels so raw, so like like I'm worried for Sammy, the protagonist, the Spielberg stand-in, in every single scene, and like to create a young character in this day and age, even if it takes place back then, that feels vulnerable yet strong, that is like has like these naked weaknesses that are also like married with his like enormous strengths, especially because you know the future story of who this kid's going to become. It just creates this weird kind of kaleidoscopic image of the past that feels unlike so many other iterations of this story. And I don't know how they do it. And that's kind of where I just like ended the film, feeling like I had an unfinished story in front of me that felt kind of like speculative and imaginative, with limitless possibilities. And yet we like literally know what happens to this kid. I don't know. It's like everything I think I wanted out of a weird reference point, but like Titanic, where it's like, I love story, like the whole idea of like the journey rather than the destination. And yet there's so many stories that take place in the past that feel like they're just retelling you things you already knew. And this did not feel like one of them, which is weird because it's about the most famous director in the world.
Yeah, no, definitely. We're all super familiar with, well, it kind of shows a different side of him though, right?
True.
Like a different sort of, because I don't feel like he ever really talked about his life that much.
Right.
And he certainly didn't show it in his movies. Like I'm looking back at his filmography and I'm just nothing's really sticking out to me and be like, oh yeah, this is an expression of Spielberg's, trauma growing up or whatever.
Right.
Like it just doesn't, he's not that type of introspective filmmaker. But yeah, I mean, to your point, it's like this movie feels alive, like really alive. And looping back to like the 1950s, I think it's interesting. Like we look at like Asteroid City being set in the 1950s. Does it matter? To me, no. Right? Like absolutely not. Like I think Wes Anderson's view of the past is really an amalgamation of different decades. But that's kind of what makes it interesting to me, right? Because it is like he has a really unique view of the past. When he tends to take things from the past and put them in the present very often. He's half the reason why we have, these sort of, I feel like he's the reason like Etsy exists or something. You know what I mean? And so with Spielberg going back into the past, I mean, he also did this with West Side Story, which is, the way that he shot that was so beautiful and interesting. Yeah. I did love that movie. I don't know what he does. And I can't put words to it. And it was so fascinating watching this after watching Asteroid City, because, you talk about grief and you talk about emotions. Like I cried probably like 6 or 7 times watching The Fabelmans.
Wow.
And I maybe shed half a tear during Asteroid City. And it's like, that's not like a measure of a great film or not, but like it does denote to me that there's an emotional intimacy and sort of that Spielberg is able to conjure. Yeah. Just he's always been this way. And I was just watching Saving Private Ryan on Pluto like 2 nights ago, and same thing. It's just like his ability to just have a single actor on screen. I don't know what he's doing. I don't know what techniques he's using. But he's able to elicit viewer emotion, which is a huge criticism against him. Right. Yeah. Because people say that, what is that? Saccharine. Right. It's manipulative. Blah, 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 blah. I'm not saying those people are wrong. I'm just saying that it's there and everybody knows that it's there. And I think on top of that, I mean, there's so many beautiful scenes in this, like the one where his mother's dancing in front of the lights when they're camping, and like the daughter's trying to get in front of her because there's like, you can see through her dress. It's like, it's beautiful, beautiful filmmaking. But the thing that stood out to me the most in the Fabelmans was the scene when he shows the beach film for the school, and then the beautiful sort of guy that has treated him very poorly, the way he depicts him on screen, and that whole interaction in the hallway afterwards, and how he depicts the other guy as kind of a bully. Just like, and you think about like being self-referential, looking yourself in the mirror. To me, that's what he did there was very raw, like very, very, very raw, and surprisingly, I think, emotionally transparent. That like he is sort of pointing to himself as somebody who has done this thing his entire life. He's put people up on the screen and characters and aggrandized them in a way that I think he feels a little bit like he was irresponsible. Right. And then like you can see him working through this guilt of art and filmmaking. And like even when his uncle visits, and it's like there's this struggle between family and art and this whole thing. I just found I didn't love the movie as a whole because I think the ending was really messy and it didn't really tie together to me as like a narrative or a good feature film. But there's sequences here and there's moments here that are just, I think, incredibly insightful, emotionally honest and raw, especially coming from someone with the stature of Steven Spielberg. Like making a movie like this in your 70s is just kind of crazy to me. I don't know. I mean, it's a great film, and you look at the critics and it's got like a 99 Rotten Tomatoes score. Like there's not a lot of like noise against it or criticism of it. It does seem a little bit safe in some areas in terms of it, but like I don't know. I think overall it was a pretty amazing movie. Yeah, totally. And also like a good depiction of the 50s.
Right. I think one of the better ones of all the films that we're going to be talking about throughout this cycle of episodes. It has the kind of navel-gazy sheen that is just kind of like hard to resist, considering just like all the reference points of movies taking place in the 50s and media taking place in the 50s in general. And yet it really does show so much of like the brokenness of that time period that was so kind of like bubbling under the surface for so many people. And go back to your point about like the bully hallway scene, that's a huge one for me too. And it parallels with kind of the big fight that his parents get into when they make the move to the bigger house in California, and then for just like a split second, but it's everywhere on the internet. It's burned into everybody's memory because it hit so hard. The shot of Sammy imagining himself filming the fight between his mom and dad.
I love that shot. It was so good.
Oh my god, it's so good.
So
good. And so I want to use that to piggyback into why I felt the ending worked. Because you're right, it does, and I think that's purposeful. It also feels like a theater thing where it's like you put a button on the end of it that on the surface seems incongruent with the rest of the film. I think you could make the argument that it's not incongruent just by the sheer fact that like so much of the movie is him trying to like become this person, and he finally meets somebody that has become this person, and it's this kind of like sudden letdown of like, what is this guy talking? Like my hero, the person that I think is like one of the greatest artists of all time, John Ford, is just like a grumpy guy with an eye patch smoking a cigar that like barely gives anybody notice or that kind of thing. But I do think the question of the horizon, top, bottom, or middle, is hugely self-referential to Spielberg's whole career, right? Because the final shot is the camera tilting up so that we get that horizon at the top of the screen. Because I think Spielberg has been kind of pigeonholed, like you were kind of referencing, as this kind of like emotionally manipulative populist director for so long, that his movies kind of represent, the ones that work like clockwork, that are appealing to everybody, that have like a horizon in the middle, just like a standard kind of film. but then it also works alongside with like this kind of sadness that runs through the film. And
yes. Oh yeah.
Right. And you could easily look at, you know, the camera panning down because like his family is broken now, right? Like he's living with his dad in this small apartment, like Paul Dano with those horribly sad eyes. And yet the camera pans up. Like it's finally like, it's such a hopeful ending to like this movie that has this huge trajectory of like sadness and self-flagellation, which also like you could, you know, I don't know a lot about Judaism, but could look at all of the religious connections to the film too. So I don't know. I really love endings like that feel conclusive, but also feel like you have to kind of work at them to pick them apart. Also going back to Asteroid City, right?
Yeah. It's I feel like I have to rewatch it. I really do. I feel like it's one of those movies that it was almost like some of the scenes were so good that they were like distracting.
Yes.
It was just like, oh man, this is really intense. It's also really intense. It's a very intense film. Asteroid City I'll probably watch again just to kind of I always rewatch his movies. You know what's weird about Asteroid City is it somehow made me like Steve Zissou more. Zissou, what the fuck it is. I don't know why. It's almost like I'm longing for Wes to like emotionally engage again. And I feel like I know that you said, they're just, oh my God, the scenes in Asteroid City where it's just the dry back and forth. Even like the one where he tries really hard with the two smoking people on break from the play. It just, nothing's landing for me, unfortunately.
Oh, it's fine. You should do a fan edit of just the emotional parts.
It would be like less than a trailer length. So.
Oh gosh! All right, you ready for some trivia to round this out? Okay, Dan. We are kind of breaking some rules with this cycle of episodes, but that's totally fine since they're self-imposed, anyways. I'm giving you, rather than a decade of films to look at, basically just a 5-year period. We're looking at 2017 through 2022.
Right.
So pretty recent. I'm not sure if you're familiar with all of these, but I'm going to once again start easy, go hard. The basic idea is I describe a film using the narration from the film's screenplay. It's a movie that was released between 2017 and 2022, but takes place in the 1950s. All right. First one is a fun one and a pretty obvious one. Exterior, Main Street, day, 1950s Americana. Palm trees line the streets. A man drives a sky blue 2-seater Thunderbird. His happy wife in the passenger seat next to him.
Don't worry, darling.
Oh, good. Yeah, okay. You've got this.
I just rewatched that, by the way.
Oh, why? Why would you do
I had a friend in town. He liked it.
I felt nervous about including that one because we did have a conversation about whether or not to include Pleasantville. Since it doesn't technically take place in the 50s, it takes place in a 50s-like world. Don't worry, darling. Spoiler alert, they're in a computer. Anyways.
Like it matters.
No, it doesn't. Okay, here's the next one. Crows scatter, fluttering, flapping wings, obscuring our view until it's completely black. On screen, the following occurred in 1952. Then it slides across our screen with the black, and a dusty, dimmed light filters through a latticed opening inside a confessional, revealing Father Michael Burke.
The Nun.
Yes, good work.
Yes. Yeah,
we excited for The Nun 2 later this year?
I'm going to watch it and then just rip on it, probably. Like
sounds fun.
Yeah.
From the screenwriter of Malignant and Megan, though.
Barf me rotten.
I'm excited. All right, next. This one I think you'll get, but I guess I don't know for sure. Exterior, establishing shot, the House of Woodcock, London, dawn. A Georgian house in Fitzroy Square, 1955. Camera pushes in and booms up. Cut to interior apartment, London, 1955 morning. Watching the art of Reynolds Woodcock. Late 50s, getting dressed in the morning.
Oh, Phantom Thread.
There we go. Okay, good.
Yeah.
We'll circle back to Paul Thomas Anderson next episode, looking at The Master as well as Terrence Malick's The Tree of Life. But we got 2 more questions before we close out the show. I'm pretty certain you haven't seen either of these films, but I think you'll get this one at least.
Okay, we'll see.
Interior, Franklin home, Aretha's room, night. Sounds of a party. We hear music and people chattering and laughing. 10-year-old Aretha sleeps soundly in bed, cradling a black doll. There is a picture of Aretha with her mother Barbara on the bedside table, along with the clock. Yeah, okay, good.
Yeah, I saw that. That's good. I like.
Oh, you did see that? Okay, yeah. A decent biopic. Good.
Yeah, it's pretty good. It's not, nothing to write home about. But
I kind of memory hold it, so I was surprised to see how much of it took place in the 50s. Last one, I will be very surprised if you've seen this. I have not, so I've got some clues in case you don't get it.
Okay.
Interior, the New York Hall of Records. Lionel sits at the table with documents, pouring through them. Close on, documents of incorporation for Belmont Developers, Inwood Residential Services, applications for city contracts. Details captured as Lionel writes in his notebook. The companies were incorporated in 1952. Prior contracts with city, none. References of note, none. Then he sees officers, William Lieberman, George Spalding, Tom Brooks.
Yikes. Darn it. Yeah, give me a clue.
It was written and directed by a first-time actor turned filmmaker.
Oh, that doesn't help.
And that actor turned filmmaker's name...
Go for it. Yeah, what is it?
Also appeared in Asteroid City, Edward Norton.
Oh, Motherless Brooklyn?
Yeah. Sorry. No, yeah, I had to stretch for that one. Who has seen it? And it sounds really boring based on that. I don't even think Edward narration. Seen it. Oh, maybe that's what Asteroid City is about: is his character going crazy because he can't believe that he wrote and directed Motherless Brooklyn. What do we have in store, not just next episode, but through the rest of the season, Dano?
Tree of Life coming up. Next episode, Far From Heaven, the 2000s, LA Confidential, the 1990s, Desert Hearts, with Molly coming back for that one, the 80s, and The Last Picture Show, 1970s. And then we're going to close it out, the set in 1950s cycle here, with Cool Hand Luke and Rebel Without a Cause, kind of to trace it all the way back to the 50s to kind of figure out how they viewed about their own decade and their time, and how that has changed over the last, whatever it's been, 60, 70, 80 years? I guess 80 years.
Ooh, yeah.
In any event, thanks for listening. This has been Film Trace.